Each entry in the Final Fantasy franchise has introduced a varied cast of characters. Many have ended up sticking with players for one reason or another, with iconic heroes and villains like Cloud, Sephiroth and Kefka cementing their respective places within video gaming history, serving as some of the best examples of their archetypes. It's important to stress, however, that a good story is made up of more than just the big heroes and villains. Sometimes, as a way of providing emotional highs and lows, a good story needs comic relief or tragic characters. Maybe it even makes sense to include a wise, older character to provide exposition and advice, and every once in a while, what a good story really needs is a character that players will love to hate. Some of these characters do sport tragic backstories, but their actions simply cannot be explained by anything other than greed, hatred, and cowardice. They are bad guys who love being cruel for cruelty's sake, and they're only looking out for numero uno. In other words, they are corrupt to the core. What's interesting is that quite often these characters are not the main antagonist. They are instead critically flawed lesser antagonists, characters who abused their powerful positions, used people as playthings, and displayed putrid personalities. So, with the usual caveat that we're only going to focus on one character per title, here's 7 characters so corrupt it chills your spine. And for our first entry, let's start with Final Fantasy VII's very own titan of industry and grand champion of capitalism, President Shinra. In today's modern world, there's no better symbol of corruption than a crooked CEO. From TV to movies to video games, nothing compares to the image of a business juggernaut that uses their connections and money for their own personal pursuits. The wellness of others be damned. Throughout the history of the Final Fantasy series, most corrupt figures were either emperors, local rulers, or military leaders. Therefore, when the release of Final Fantasy VII flung the series into a world that looked quite similar to the real world of the late 1990s, it was an obvious evolution that the most corrupt character in the game would take on the form of a shady CEO. Originally an industrious and ambitious weapons manufacturer, President Shinra ran the Shinra Electric Power Company, a corporation which, through the discovery of Mako energy, had an absolute energy monopoly over the entire world. And as if having control over such a vital resource wasn't enough, especially considering it was literally killing the planet, President Shinra's methods for maintaining the stranglehold were even more unsettling. For problems that needed more discreet handling, the Turks would be employed to undertake a variety of underhanded and ruthless tactics like kidnapping, sabotage, and murder. They would even be responsible for covering up the accidental eradication of entire towns. For problems that were much larger in scale, such as there being a nation that needed strong arming, President Shinra would then call on the Shinra Public Security Forces and their elite fighting force known as Soldier. Using these tools, President Shinra ensured that the Shinra Corporation was the most powerful entity around, forcing those who did not bow to its proliferation of Mako reactors to comply through scorched earth battle tactics, such as was the case in Corel and Wutai. In addition, he proved time and time again through Shinra's clashes with Avalanche that he was more than willing to commit acts of extreme violence on his own citizens, even going so far as to drop an entire section of Midgar on the people of the slums. To make matters worse, President Shinra would then use these horrible moments of extreme suffering to his advantage, manipulating the general public into further supporting his cause. And it's precisely this way of operating that made him so corrupt. Unlike the unapologetically and cartoonish evil Hojo, President Shinra had a vested interest in maintaining a positive and sympathetic public image. He attempted to maintain this with potent propaganda, all while allowing and facilitating figures in his employ like Heidegger, Scarlet, and Hojo to effectively run rampant with nefarious experiments and experimental weapons, believing that through these efforts he would gain control of the Promised Land, which would enable him to rule with an iron fist. Intense greed is a common thread that ties all corrupt characters, Final Fantasy or otherwise. But while sometimes this greed takes on a more personal, localized form, other times it manifests as something with an inertia all of its own, an insatiable lust for power, knowledge, and eventually dominion over everything imaginable. This was certainly the case when it came to Final Fantasy VI's Emperor Gestahl, who, as a ruler of the Gestalian Empire, ran a cruel campaign of expansion and subjugation through his mighty Magitech army. Growing up in the mechanical city of Vector, it wasn't until taking over the empire from his father that Gestal began eyeing world domination. Quickly becoming aggressive with the other world powers, it was during his conquest of the southern continent that he discovered the Sealed Gate and the world of the Espers. Gestal proceeded to use the Empire's forces to abduct a considerable amount of Espers, subsequently tasking Cid with experimenting on these prisoners to extract their power. Following the invention of Magitech, Emperor Gestal saw his dominion expand significantly. But as his desire for power grew, so too did the atrocities committed and endorsed by his name and title. Most of these were of course due to Kefka, who was not just Gestal's court mage, but also the first test subject of the Magitech method of infusing magic into humans. This process left Kefka extremely twisted, evil, and unpredictable. But, all the while Kefka seemed subservient, Gestal was more than happy to use him, turning a blind eye to the unthinkable acts that were committed as a result, all in the name of his own expansion. These acts would end up getting so extreme that even General Leo, Gestal's most loyal follower, would question the ethics. But it would be that overconfidence and blasé attitude that would be Gestal's downfall. Blinded by power, he failed to see that Kefka had been plotting behind his back for some time, and after losing his empire and betting all he had, including his own people, Gestal would be revealed to be a small and petty man. In Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, there is a parable, often taught on its own, known as the Grand Inquisitor. This story tells the tale of a hypothetical second coming and how the Grand Inquisitor treats the return of the Messiah. More specifically, it details a discussion between the two on the fact that the Inquisitor believes the false hope of salvation that faith provides to the masses is preferable, for him, to the lie that not everyone can be saved if all are free to choose their own paths. Now, while a heavy philosophical topic to barely skim the surface of, this story is, interestingly enough, very relevant when discussing our next entry, Final Fantasy X's Grand Maester Micah. Micah appeared as an elderly figure, projecting a kind and wise image to the people of Spira. Serving in his position for 50 years, he had brought the faith of Yevon to the Guado and Ronso people and was seen as an emissary for peace, widely loved by the people of Spira. Below the surface though, Maester Micah was something else altogether. After learning the truth about the cycle of sin and the ensuing calm, Micah had become disillusioned and become convinced that he alone could provide hope, albeit false hope, to the people of Spira as the head of Yevon. He therefore made it his personal mission to hold on to the position of power for as long as possible and by any means necessary, even if it meant destroying the very people who represented Spira's salvation. Unbeknownst to everyone, except a chosen few, this meant that after Micah passed away, he refused to be sent. And so he could continue to maintain his influence over Spira, Micah acted as judge and jury for those who he deemed a threat to the status quo. Driven by self-importance and arrogance, this saw Micah value the duty of his position over actually helping people. He wanted nothing more than to be the sole shepherd overseeing the cycle of death of the world, using the faith of Yevon to keep the masses in check, as he believed this was the only salvation the people of Spira could ever hope to have. Those who threatened this vision would be banished to the Via Infinito, and perhaps the most extreme known instance of this corruption was evidenced when Yuna declared that Seymour had murdered his father, a maester of Yevon. In response, it was Yuna who was sentenced to death, not Seymour. With Yuna surviving the execution and then subsequently defeating Yunalesca, Micah realised he had failed in his self-appointed task. And believing Spira was now doomed, as he could no longer be the shepherd to protect them from what he believed would be their inevitable fate, he willingly relinquished his life and drifted away into nothingness. The tale of Final Fantasy Tactics was one of political intrigue, chock full of double crosses, betrayals and twists that longtime fans of Final Fantasy found quite dark and mature for the series at the time. Final Fantasy XII continued this trend, featuring a similarly complex political story packed with characters sporting hidden agendas who used their positions and the people around them for their own selfish ends. Vayne Solidor and Dr. Cid are tempting figures in this regard to discuss. But we've chosen to feature an individual who truly embodied the theme of corruption and had no redeemable qualities, Judge Bergen. A supporter of Vane Solidor's designs for the throne of the Arcadian Empire, Judge Bergen was a judge magistrate and one of the highest ranking officials in the Arcadian army. Known particularly for his cruelty, Bergen was an individual who respected power more than anything else, and admired Vane's use of patricide, war, and manufactured nethicide as a way of getting what he wanted. For someone who held such an esteemed role in the Empire, Judge Bergen did his title a severe dishonour in his conduct. Instead of serving as a defender of the people, Bergen looked down on everyone he thought weak and inferior. This even extended to his own colleagues, the judge magistrates, as shown by his assault on Judge Drace as she sought to question Vane for the death of Emperor Gramis. Bergen's assault on Mount Ber Amaseis also showed his complete disregard for life and how corrupted by power he had become. Reveling in brutality and destruction, Bergen took great delight in slaughtering droves of peaceful refugees that could not fight back. This was then capped by the murder of Grand Kiltis, one of the most powerful and respected figures in all of Ivalice. But this would end up being one action too far, as Bergen's rampages would end up sending him to an early grave. The corrupt have no true allegiance to anything but themselves, and many fear the loss of whatever gives them authority or power, whether that be physical prowess, political standing, or riches. This often makes them cowards who, when faced with an obstacle that they cannot remove due to exploiting their influence, leads them to lash out violently or beg for mercy. And it just so happens that our next individual, Norg, from Final Fantasy VIII, does precisely both of those things. A member of the reclusive Shumi tribe from the Trebia region, Norg was always a bit of an outcast amongst other members of his species. Leaving his home of Shumi village, Norg instead sought to travel the world in search of money, and he eventually amassed a large personal fortune through unknown means. Using this money, he helped to finance Sid Kramer's Balam Garden, but even though he remained in the shadows, leaving the training and administration of Balam to Sid, his influence was everywhere, and Sid was always wary. That influence would be exerted through the Garden faculty, who served as extensions of Norg's authority and will. Aside from being a visual reminder to Sid of who was really in charge, the faculty would also impose their will on everyone else, bullying students and teachers at Norg's behest. Such was Norg's influence that, as a way of gaining some new funds, Sid was forced to hire Seed members out as mercenaries as opposed to being trained for their intended purpose, to defeat a sorceress. In fact, it was when Seed was called upon to fulfill its goal, to assassinate sorceress Adia, that Norg finally laid all his cards on the table. Learning that Adia wished to destroy Balam Garden, Norg set about having an all-out war against Sid and his supporters for control so that he could negotiate with Adia, handing over Sid, Squall and the other collaborators as a way of saving his own skin and his investment. But after realizing he had lost, instead of facing up to what he had done, Norg decided to run away and hide. Sometimes the gravity of flirting with absolute power draws one in and leaves them a cruel, ruthless, corrupt shell of their former self, despite their best efforts to do what they thought was right at the time. Final Fantasy is full of characters like this, and the developers at Square, and subsequently Square Enix, have loved showing the dangers of flying too close to the proverbial sun. Someone who epitomized this more than most was Idolus Aldercapt, the Emperor of Niflheim. Originally a very kind and benevolent ruler who was adored by his people, Idolus underwent a significant change in demeanour in the years leading up to the events of the main game. As explained by Aranea, this change started to manifest after the loss of his wife and the discovery of Arden Azunia. Afterwards, the Emperor's noble vision for seeing his homeland prosper under his rule was twisted into an obsession with Magitech, the revival of the Solheim civilization, and a violent expansionist foreign policy. Idolus became enthralled with the idea of ruling over all of Eos, no matter the cost, as he believed himself to be the one true king. As such, he had designs on the Crystal of Lucis and the Ring of the Lucii. But unlike other territories, they were a significant threat due to the very powers he hoped to obtain. Putting his military's best scientists to work, no form of experimentation was off limits, and this saw them attempt to use the Star Scourge, a demonic corrupting force, to not only power their efforts, but also as a way of allowing Idolus to become immortal. Many of these ambitions would come to pass, but even though Idolus won the short-term war against King Regis, he would end up losing the more important battle that was still to come. And those dreams of immortality that had been whispered in his ear by Arden would never end up materializing. And that brings us onto our last entry, a character who embodies corruption and cruelty so well that even the very mention of him will stir up visceral feelings of players who are familiar with their acts, and that character is Asahi Sas Brutus. And this is your spoiler warning if you have yet to play Stormblood. Appearing in the Stormblood expansion, Asahi was a member of the Garlean Imperial Army. Originally hailing from Doma, a region occupied by the Empire, he was conscripted into the army at a young age, idolizing and obsessing over the fearsome Xenos, as it was Xenos who saved an impressionable Asahi from being set upon by Doman's soldiers in his youth. So, what made him so corrupt? When first encountered in the Stormblood expansion, Asahi appeared to the player as a representative of a more moderate pacifist faction within the Empire. Initially friendly, this was just a cover, as Asahi's kind and courteous manner would soon give way to abject cruelty. Fueled by his admiration for Xenos and his extreme anger that his hero was defeated at the hands of the Warrior of Light, Asahi did not in fact believe in any of the ideals he professed, and sought instead to use his position in the movement and the Empire as a way of spurning on an international incident. Things would get even worse when throwing Yotsuyu into the mix. Unsympathetic to her truly horrible upbringing, Asahi had a deep-seated hatred for Yotsuyu. He believed that she received preferential treatment from his hero Xenos, due in part to Xenos appointing her to the position of Imperial Viceroy in Doma, and as such, he deemed her expendable. This would see Asahi orchestrate Yotsuyu's transformation into the primal Tsukuyomi, and when she was ultimately defeated, Asahi proceeded to gun her down. Claiming there was nothing the Warrior of Light could do to him, as he had diplomatic immunity, Asahi proceeded to kick Yotsuyu while she was on the ground, dying, berating her for receiving more attention from Xenos than him. Using her last ounce of strength, Yotsuyu then caught Asahi unaware and killed her adoptive brother, bringing his sad and vindictive story to a close. Truth be told, this whole list could have easily consisted of individuals from Final Fantasy XIV. The game is just simply full of them. That being said, we feel that Asahi went just a step further than the rest, crossing the line into absolute sadist territory and standing, quite easily, as one of the most cruel and corrupt individuals across the entire franchise. And that, as they say, is that. They were 7 characters so corrupt it chills your spine. Now we know there's probably a few we didn't include, so be sure to let us know in the comments below which characters had you shivering from disgust, and if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube member supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Gaussian D. Kujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, Lord of Morning, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.